So let's start with the eye. We'll start by listing and describing the main structures of the eye, and then we'll move more internally looking at the parts of the eye. So outside of the eye, we have some familiar structures here, including the eyelashes, which allow for the collection of dust and other particles in the air so that they don't get into our eye, causing damage. Eyelids, in a similar vein, provide protection to our eye. Eyebrows as well provide protection to our eye, catching things like sweat from our forehead as well as dust and not allowing them to enter into the eye. If we look at the eye, there's 2 points on either side of the eye, the left and right side. And so we have the medial canthus. The medial canthus is this point on the medial side of our eye. And the lateral canthus is the point on the lateral side of our eye. Above the eye, we have the lacrimal gland. This is actually the gland that secretes the fluid that coats our eye and also provides protection, what we would call tears if we were overproducing it. As that fluid comes out and coats the eye and provides protection, capturing dust and so on, that fluid will move towards the medial canthus and it will enter into or through a hole here called the lacrimal puncta. So in the normal conditions, when we're not overproducing the fluid moves towards the lacrimal puncta after picking up dust particles and other particles, enters into the lacrimal puncta, and then down into the lacrimal sac. The lacrimal sac then moves that fluid down to the nasolacrimal duct. The nasolacrimal duct, as the name implies, connects the lacrimal sac down to the nasal passage, down to the nose. When we overproduce this fluid, as in the image down on the right side, we ultimately are producing what we would call tears. And so as we overproduce this, some of that fluid will come out of our eye. But as well, if you've ever had the experience where you've actually cried or been overproducing tears because something's got into your eye, what ends up happening is your nose starts to feel like it's running. And that's because there's an excess fluid, and this extra fluid is running down through this lacrimal puncta into the lacrimal sac, nasolacrimal duct, and into your nose. Tears are not only overproduced while crying, but can be overproduced when you have something in your eye, if you get too much dust in your eye. And that is your body's response to try to flush out those particles in order to have them not cause damage. We can now compare the extrinsic and intrinsic muscles of the eye. And so here we're looking at the extrinsic muscles of the eye that cause motion of the eyeball. We'll start with the superior rectus. The superior rectus is, as the name implies, superior or above the eye, and allows for movement of the eyeball up. So to look up, you're flexing your superior rectus. The superior oblique, which is kind of hard to see here, but kind of wraps around the eyeball sideways, and it allows for a little bit of rotation of the eye. We have the lateral rectus, which allows us to move our eyes out to the side. And we have the inferior oblique, so the oblique muscle that allows for some rotation of the eye, but that is beneath the eye, and the inferior rectus that is beneath the eye and allows us to look down. Looking at the intrinsic muscles of the eye, here we're looking at the iris of the eye with the pupil in the middle. So the colored portion of your eye and then the dark pupil in the middle. Ultimately, the pupil is a hole to allow light into our eye so that it will hit on the photoreceptors that we'll look at in a few minutes. But we have 2 muscles here in the iris. We have the circular muscle and the radial muscle. And these 2 serve functions as follows. When the circular muscle contracts, we undergo meiosis. Our pupil actually gets smaller. And this occurs when we're in a situation where there's lots of light. So if I go out on a sunny summer day, there's lots of light coming towards me into my eye, my pupil will actually contract and get smaller. And it's because my circular muscle is contracting. Let's say I get home late at night, I go into my dark house, there's no lights on, I need as much light as possible to get into my eye. And so in that circumstance, my radial muscle will contract to pull the circular muscle out and undergo mydriasis, an increase in the size of the pupil. This will then allow as much light as possible in so I can see in the dark circumstance. Moving on, we can look at this cross-section of the eye in order to list and describe the main structures of the eye. We've already looked at some of these, so at the front of the eye we can see the iris. We were just looking at the muscles of the iris in the previous slides. I'm not going to go through each of these within this video, listing them all off and what they do, but you can go to the notes, label the main structures of the eye, and then refer to your textbook or other resources in order to note what each of these structures does. But we will start by looking at some of them. So let's move the eye off to the side here, and let's take a look at this region here, the iris and a little cross-section of the lens, and a couple other items that are listed in the diagram here that we want to look at how they function beyond just the muscles that change the size of the pupil. So if we zoom in here, we can see that through this cross-section there's a number of items that we'd like to look at. So we have the pupil up at the top, as we mentioned before. This is a hole in the eye to allow light in, and surrounding this hole we have the iris, which makes up the colored portion of your eye. And it has, again, the muscles that allow for the change in size of the pupil. Behind the pupil and iris we have the lens. The lens will actually change shape, and we'll look at this in a moment, in order to focus light on the receptors within our eye. In front of the iris we have the cornea. The cornea is this sort of bulging out region in front of the iris at the very front of your eye. But between the cornea and the iris we have some fluid, and the name of that fluid is seen here, the aqueous humor. And so as light enters the eye, it travels through the cornea, then through the aqueous humor, through the pupil, and then through the lens, and then lands on the sensory receptors at the back of the eye, which we'll look at in a moment. Some other items that we want to mention here are the ciliary muscles. These are attached to the lens via these suspensory ligaments, not labeled here, but connecting the ciliary muscles to the lens itself. And these are the muscles that actually contract to allow for the lens to change shape so that we can focus on objects. Some of the parts of the eye that we should look at here are the sclera, choroid, and retina, indicated on the bottom right. The sclera is the white part of the eye. This is continuous at the front with the cornea. The choroid is a layer just beneath the sclera that has all the blood vessels in it, as well as is continuous with the ciliary bodies, which are the muscles that help to adjust the size of the lens. The innermost layer is the retina. The retina actually houses the photoreceptors triggered by light landing on them. We'll look at the retina a little later on and the different types of photoreceptors found in them. But once those photoreceptors are stimulated, they will trigger sensory neurons, and the sensory neurons will run along the innermost portion of the eye to the optic nerve and then into the brain. And so what we want to do here is define refraction and list the refractive parts of the eye. So here we're looking at a person with the eye and the brain superimposed over them so that we can analyze when we're actually looking at a light source. So let's say the sun. This is going to act as the stimulus. Light will travel from the object to our eyes. It will enter into our eye through our pupil and then land on the receptors, in this case the photoreceptors, that are on the retina. The photoreceptors will stimulate sensory neurons to then fire an action potential that brings the information into the brain along that sensory nerve, and then to the occipital lobe of the brain, the lobe of the brain that actually processes vision, as we saw earlier in the course when we looked at the lobes of the brain. So to define refraction here, this is the bending of light as it moves from one material into another. Let's zoom back in on the eye here and look at light waves as they come in from the sun, let's say, to the eye. If we had a situation here where maybe we didn't have a lens in the eye, not that this actually exists, what you can see here is that the light waves, 1, 2, and 3, come straight into the eye. It's not indicated here, but there would be a little bit of bending as the light entered into the cornea, and then the aqueous humor. And there would be very slight bending, and all the light waves would actually end up at the back of the eye, landing in this region X here, but not focused on the sensory receptors at the back of the eye. Instead, we have a lens. As we mentioned before, there's the ciliary muscle attached via the suspensory ligaments, the ligaments that attach that muscle to the lens, so that as the light waves enter into the eye, there is some refraction, some bending as the light enters into the cornea through the aqueous humor. But then we can actually change the lens shape in order to bend the light even more so that all the light waves converge on the sensory receptors found at the back of the eye. Looking at somebody who has myopia or nearsightedness, this would be a situation where the lens is either misshapen or the ciliary muscles cannot contract enough in order to change the shape of the lens, allowing the image to focus in the right spot. And so what happens is, as the light waves enter, there's bending at the cornea and the aqueous humor, and then there's a large amount of bending when the light reaches the lens. What you can see here is that the image is actually focused before ever reaching the sensory receptors found in the retina. Somebody who has hyperopia or farsightedness, the light enters through the cornea and bends, aqueous humor with more bending, and then as it travels through the lens, the light is not bent enough, and the image focuses far beyond the sensory receptors found in the retina. And so in each of these two situations of nearsightedness or farsightedness, light will land on the sensory receptors, but as our brain tries to process that information, the image will not be very sharp, and so we need some sort of modification to adjust that, like eyeglasses. We've been talking about light landing on the sensory receptors in the retina. Now let's take a closer look at that part. We have the same eye here as we saw earlier on. But let's focus in on the region here of the retina. If we were to zoom in, this is what we would see. We'd see any number of cells, and on the right side we have the sensory cells, and then inside we have some of these sensory neurons that they would then trigger, and the action potential would run to the brain. As light enters the eye, travels through the cornea, pupil, lens, the vitreous humor, and then the light approaches the retina, the light actually travels through the sensory neuron cell bodies and will land on the sensory receptors at the outermost portion of the retina. We have two types of sensory receptors, the rods and the cones. The rods, shown here, are responsible for brightness, and so they react to light, triggering a sensory neuron. But depending on the amount, they trigger in such a way that they allow for our brain to interpret bright light versus dark and everything in between. The cones, shown here, are responsible for color. And so we have three types of cones. We have cones that sense red, green, and blue light. With these three different types of cones responding to red, green, and blue light, we can actually see all the colors that we see because they are combinations of those various colors. The process of convergence is a process that actually allows us to see in 3D and involves how light lands on our eyes and then the processing of that light within the visual cortex of the occipital lobe. Because we have two eyes, light from an object, for example this dog here, will land within both eyes. If we were to look at the rear of the dog, light coming off of that region of the dog will come into our eyes, into both of them as you can note here, and will land on the right side of each of our eyes. Light from the front end of the dog, from its head, will come into our eyes, traveling in straight lines, and will land on the left side of our eyes. So each of our eyes will be gathering the same information, so the right side getting information from the rear of the dog, the left side getting information from the head of the dog. And what we can notice here is that the action potential traveling along the neurons of the optic nerve will move along such that information from the right side of each of the eyes will end up on the right side of the brain, because the information from the right side of the left eye here crosses over at the optic chiasma to the right side of the brain. Information from the left side of the right eye travels along the sensory neuron and crosses over at the optic chiasma to the left side of the brain. Ultimately then, our brain can process the information coming from the rear of the dog on the left side and then information coming from the front of the dog on the right side. In that way, we get the full image of the dog, and our brain sets up that image for us such that we see the dog in the right orientation. Also, we're processing three-dimensional images. We see the dog in 3D because the light is not landing in exactly the same part on each of the eyes, and therefore our brain can actually translate small changes in how close one region of the dog is relative to the next region because it's landing in a slightly different place on the retina.